For 2024, there are just 11 EVs left that qualify for the full $7,500 tax credit. Before we get into the rest of this updated episode, let's just roll through those models. We have the Acura ZDX, the Cadillac Lyriq, probably the upcoming Cadillac Optic, but we don't know for sure there. The Blazer EV, the Equinox EV, the Silverado EV work truck, assuming you can get one for the right price, the Ford Lightning, the Honda Prologue, the Tesla Model 3, Model Y, and Model X, but only the two-row model, and the Volkswagen ID4. What about the rest? Well, the Mustang Mach-E does not get a tax credit because Ford really seems to be pushing the qualifying batteries and battery pack assembly locations, etc., into the Lightning. They're really focusing on that particular model. The Model S is too expensive. Remember that there is a different price tier for SUVs and trucks and for sedans. So the Model S is too expensive. And that's also why you can't get a three-row Model X with the tax credit because it's also too expensive. Also qualifying for a tax credit, but half of it is the following list. And this is a much shorter list. We have the Nissan Leaf, the Rivian R1S, and the Rivian R1T. On the R1S and R1T, keep those price limits in mind too. Basically, we're talking about just the base versions of those EVs. On the plug-in hybrid front, we have an even smaller list. There is just one plug-in hybrid that qualifies for the full federal tax credit. That's the Chrysler Pacifica. If you're willing to take half of a credit, then we have a few more models to choose from. We have the Audi Q5 plug-in hybrid because it is built in North America, the Ford Escape, the Grand Cherokee, the Wrangler, and the Lincoln Corsair. And that is basically it. Now, before we get into the rules and why this number is so small, let's narrow things down even more because the adjusted gross income limits are still the same as they were before. These are not adjusting with inflation. And since we last put some of these videos out, that could definitely be a factor because wages have been going up and people that were right on the borderline may not qualify anymore. If you have an AGI of $150,000 or more filing singly, 225 filing head of household, or 300,000 filing jointly, then you do not qualify for the federal tax treatment. Now, because this has moved to a point of sale tax credit, there are some gimmies and some uh-ohs. So, as far as qualification for your AGI, you can use either this tax year or last year's tax year. So last year, if you were over the limit and you're sure that you're going to be under the limit this year, you're still okay. You can still qualify for the tax credit. If last year you were under the limit, you think 2024 you're going to be over the limit, you might want to act fast because it only counts until December 31st. Once December 31st comes along, you're now in 2025 or 2024 tax year. According to the IRS guidance that we've studied, there is no minimum tax liability requirement anymore, and that is the big deal here with the point of sale tax credit. Previously, if you were a family of 5 or 6 living in the Midwest, you owned your own home, you had lots of child tax credits, etc., it was entirely possible you had very little or no tax liability, but you could still afford an EV. And that meant that you wouldn't get the tax credit at all because you had to have a minimum tax liability. That has gone away, and now you don't have to have a minimum tax liability to get that point of sale credit. However, if you do not qualify for the credit on the adjusted gross income limits, both last year and this year, so no credit qualification at all, then when you file your taxes, you will be expected to pay that tax credit back if somehow it did get offered to you. Details on that are still a little bit sketchy, so we're waiting for additional guidance on exactly how that process will function because this is the first year that people could be in this situation. Maybe last year they didn't qualify, they thought 2024 they would qualify, but whoopsie, at the end of the year, turns out you made too much money and you don't qualify. If you're in that situation, I would hold off on your car purchase if you think you might be because we don't know exactly what the IRS is going to do. Now let's do a little bit of prediction. What EVs are coming late 2024 or early 2025 that may or may not qualify? On the Audi front, we see a lot of EVs coming from Audi, but none of them are going to be built in North America. So we don't expect any additional qualifications for Audi. And that includes the existing models like the Q4 e-tron. Even though it's related to the ID4, which is built in the United States, it is not built here, so it does not get the federal tax credit treatment. On the Cadillac front, we have a number of new EV models coming. We have the Escalade IQ, we have the Vistic, which is the smaller 3-row vehicle, and we have the Optic, which is their compact SUV. So think sort of electrified X3, something along those lines. The Optic is likely going to qualify because it uses the same batteries, motors, etc. as the other vehicles in the lineup that already qualify. The Vistic is possible depending on exactly what the price tag ends up being. And that's the same problem for the Escalade. The Escalade IQ is definitely going to be too expensive to qualify. No tax credit treatment on that one because it's simply too expensive. The Vistic, if it's priced like a Rivian R1S, it's possible that maybe low-end models could get the tax credit, but I don't expect the tax credit to apply all across the Vistic lineup. It's probably going to be too expensive. On the somewhat surprising front, we get the Stellantis EVs that are going to be new for this model year and probably on sale before the end of 2025. And that would be the Dodge Charger, of course, and the Wagoneer S. Neither of them are going to get any federal tax treatment, and I am surprised that these manufacturers didn't try and target, assembly of battery and sourcing locations, etc. to get the tax treatment. The Wagoneer S is the one that surprised me the most. I had expected that to qualify. Looks like it's not going to get any at all. The Kia EV9 is likely going to get some sort of tax credit treatment, but we don't know exactly when that is going to happen. They have indicated it's going to be early 2025, so certainly not calendar year 2024. But that does mean that they're looking towards the future. And that's pretty logical because of their announcements. Not only has EV9 production actually moved to the United States, but battery production for the EV9 is also going to move to the US. Right now, EV9s are being built in the US, but the battery packs are coming from South Korea and other locations inside the Hyundai conglomerate, and they don't qualify for the tax credit. But they have said that they intend to qualify, and that is coming soon. So they've been really aggressive on that. Also aggressive, of course, is their sister company, Hyundai. And so the Ioniq 7 is likely going to get its tax credit treatment right when it goes on sale. I expect that the sourcing changes that are happening for EV9 will be done right on time for the Ioniq 7's launch. A little bit less clear is the Polestar 3. Production recently moved to North America. We should actually see those North American-built Polestar 3s on sale probably by the end of September or maybe early October, somewhere around then, but we don't know whether or not they're going to get any sort of federal tax credit. Obviously, the price tag is a little bit of a problem on those. The price tag is high. The absolute base model should be able to qualify, and an upcoming single motor model probably could as well, assuming the batteries start getting sourced from somewhere else. And that is the tricky component we just don't have any visibility into. The battery assembly, materials, and mineral sourcing requirements for EVs and tax credit treatment are the reason that there is this uncertainty and why we don't know for sure what's going to happen in 2025. As of January 1st, 2024, no more than 2% of components can come from countries of concern. And that is going to drop technically to zero January 1st, 2025. But recently, the IRS did rule that, how do we actually say this? That graphite anodes will be excluded. I want to make sure I get this phrasing right, because it is impractical to trace. And as long as there is due diligence, then the IRS will accept that manufacturers have tried their best to make sure nothing is coming from China or Russia, Iran, etc. But if a little bit squeaks through, it seems like it's going to be okay. Also, the graphite in the anodes, apparently it's hard to trace that, they're saying. I don't know if I buy that necessarily, but they're saying it's hard to trace, and that's why those are going to be excluded, at least through 2027. That gives battery manufacturers a bit of breathing room, at least for the moment, but keep in mind that the material sourcing requirements continue to ratchet up year after year for a while. So, for instance, next year, the critical minerals component in the battery goes from 50% to 60%. The next year it goes to 70%, and then to 80%, etc. So there is going to be a continual ratcheting up on these requirements. Well, there is also no inflation adjustment for your adjusted gross income to personally qualify or the MSRP caps on the EVs. So really interesting things converging there. Now let's get to some of our frequently asked questions. On the subject of adjusted gross income, I recommend that you talk with a tax professional here, but generally speaking, adjusted gross income is your final income after your deductions of student loan interest, alimony payments, etc. So around 95% of tax filers, according to the IRS in 2023, will be below the income caps for a new EV at the moment. Although, keep in mind that generally speaking, the 80th percentile American doesn't actually tend to buy a new EV. That actually tends to be a fairly wealthy person, so the adjusted gross income caps can definitely be a bit of a concern there. The next thing to know is that leasing doesn't matter because you're not getting the tax credit. The leasing company gets a tax credit, and corporations get that tax credit regardless of where the battery is manufactured or where the vehicle is manufactured, etc. That is part of why we see some really stellar lease deals on certain EVs. This is known as the EV leasing loophole. Now, other thing to keep in mind there is that not every company passes that tax credit along, and I know some people feel cheated about that, but remember, it's a tax credit, it's not a tax refund for the corporation. So that corporation does have to have a minimum tax liability in order for that to work. And if you lease your EV in January and they don't file their taxes until December, assuming they're on a calendar fiscal year, of course, then remember that company is waiting for that tax credit to happen. And so, there are some financial concerns around that, and that's why some companies don't pass it along. Also, depending on the structure of the captive finance arm, they may not actually get that credit because the company may be choosing to roll finances up some different way, and maybe that captive finance arm doesn't actually get that credit. The next thing is, where is all of this sourcing? How is it being done? Where do we find more information out about it? This is something I really wish we actually got more info on. I would love to see on a window sticker exactly where the raw materials of the battery, etc., come from, so maybe the consumer could make a more informed choice if they wanted to. But at this point in time, we do not have that ability. There are some manufacturers out there that give us a lot more information than others. Interestingly, Polestar is actually one of the most out there companies as far as providing information on the life cycle carbon emissions of a vehicle. But even they are not really telling us, this is where the lithium came from, and this is where the copper came from, etc. We don't have that level of detail on the sourcing, and that's something that I would really love to see. The next question I get frequently, especially towards the end of the year, has to do with binding contracts. And this is a way to try and get the tax treatment of a previous year when you're actually going to take delivery the following year. The IRS has historically allowed this to function, but it does require that there be a substantial down payment. So this tends to not be, I paid $500 to put down on my $60,000 EV. It generally tends to be large percentages. So if you put $20,000 down on the purchase of your $60,000 EV, that's probably something that would survive an IRS audit. And this is one of those kind of things where, you may put a deposit down, then you may file your taxes and try and do it that way, because looks like you would have to actually apply for the tax credit on your filing. It wouldn't be able to be point of sale at that point, but you would be able to do it retroactively, effectively. The tricky bit there is that if you get audited and then they decide that your deposit wasn't big enough, then that's going to be a real bummer. The last thing we should talk about is sort of a group of questions around which companies benefit the most from this legislation, whether that's a good idea, a bad idea, its impact on the economy, all that stuff. Let's just sort of toss that into one big ball of X here. Obviously, the biggest benefit rains down on Tesla because they're the biggest EV manufacturer in the US and they build all of their EVs right here in the US. And that means essentially everything would qualify, assuming that we didn't have the price caps on vehicles like the 3-row Model X or the Model S sedan. Battery sourcing, that has been, a little bit of a change here at Tesla over the years. They did start pulling batteries in from China for certain low-cost models, but it appears that they have stopped doing that because otherwise those models wouldn't get the tax treatment. And that is one of those areas of debate. A lot of folks out there didn't like this legislation. They didn't like the government coming in and doing whatever. Lots of opinions on that front. I think it definitely achieved the goal for the most part because it really forced EV manufacturers to reconsider North American production. They hadn't been doing that for a while. It caused Tesla, the biggest manufacturer that already was building a huge amount in the U.S., to actually go, let's change our mind and let's bring that battery production back to the U.S. Even though it was a relatively small slice of the pie, they did effectively cut that slice out and brought it all back to the U.S. General Motors, very well positioned here. It really appears that they knew this was going to happen. They had planned this all along because their batteries and their vehicles are built in qualifying regions, which is not just the United States, of course, mind you. So this, helps the entire North American economy, not specifically the U.S. If you specifically want to help the U.S. economy, your best bet is honestly going to be with a Tesla or upcoming Kia or Polestar models, perhaps. Now, Hyundai and Kia, they've also been really aggressive. They're the most aggressive foreign auto manufacturer outside Volkswagen, I would say. Volkswagen definitely planned for the ID4 to be built in the United States, and they definitely have been really, really focused on battery sourcing, etc., for the U.S. market. But not all of the EV models that we see from the Volkswagen conglomerate are going to come from the U.S., and Audi is that really good example there. Also, of course, Porsche. Those are not built in the U.S., so they don't get the tax credit. On the other hand, we have Volvo and Polestar that are going to be building the EX90 and the Polestar 3 in the United States. Whether or not they get a tax credit, that remains to be seen. It's going to depend on where certain things are sourced from. On the other hand, the Koreans, they have been taking more of a Volkswagen-like approach, where they're not a domestic car company, but they're investing big time in production in North America. The Kia EV9 has moved here. We're going to see the Ioniq 7 moving production, or I should say starting production in the United States whenever it is debuted. And it does look like most of the EV models from the Hyundai conglomerate are going to be assembled in the United States given time. And that given time is the tricky thing, because Hyundai and Kia were caught a little off guard by the fact that even though we have a free trade agreement with South Korea, that South Korea was not given the same treatment as Canada was, for instance, on the assembly of EVs. The bigger surprise for me, I think, actually is Dodge and Jeep with the Stellantis conglomerate, that somehow or another the new Wagoneer is not going to qualify for the federal tax credit. The Charger, the upper-end models would always have been too expensive, so that is a little bit more logical. $60,000 is the cap there, but the Wagoneer, it's definitely going to be in that price range, I would have thought, and it doesn't appear that there is any plan to have any sort of qualification for the tax credit. How this continues to play out long-term will remain to be seen, but if you're concerned about battery production and EV production in this electrification transition moving off shores overseas, by and large, that doesn't seem to happen. Although, obviously, again, Canada, North America, Canada, Mexico, etc., there is definitely benefit raining down on our neighbors. But geopolitically, that seems to be a lot more desirable than battery manufacturing and EV manufacturing moving to China. And that's why some manufacturers that were scrambling over the last few months to try and say, we have a new plan, that's why that's going on. Volvo decided to move the EX30 production to Europe, for instance. So they've actually hit the sales in North America on that pause button there. And it does look like that is probably why they stepped up the movement plans for moving production of Polestar 3 to the US and Polestar 4 to South Korea, etc. So it definitely seems to have an impact. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and what other videos like this would you like to see on the channel. See all of you later.